a character, Jean-Baptiste, who is a voluntary French fighter in Ukraine. It's very rare to have a French fighter on our set.
Go ahead, Jean-Baptiste. Sit next to Xavier Titelman.
There you go, your friend. You are buddies. He's not here by chance. He was brought by a good friend, not by chance. Good evening, Jean-Baptiste, a French fighter in Ukraine alongside the Ukrainians. We will introduce you more completely later. And as we were saying, often French volunteer fighters have spoken from a distance. I believe that it's the first time on a French television set, often that a fighter is there. And I specify that you continue to fight. You're going back there, is that right?
Yes, you have a little 2-week break.
Yes, a 2-week vacation. Thank you for being there on the situation in Ukraine, on the front, in the trenches. We see some images of you that testify to what you were doing in the trenches just a few days ago. But first, Emily, Russia showing a capacity for action and recruitment. We
showed you these images of Vladimir Putin, who just signed a decree to increase the size of his army, the Russian army, which will go up to 2,389,000 people, including 1.5 million soldiers. Look at these images that are still coming to us from this Russian Ministry of Defense. In Rostov-on-Don, he opened a recruitment office where volunteers can sign up to join the armed forces currently fighting in Ukraine. We were waiting for details from Russia. We got them through the voice of Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesperson, who says we had no choice. We are threatened.
This increase is due to the number of threats that weigh on our country along the perimeter of our borders, but also to the extremely hostile environment at our western borders and the instability at our eastern borders. This requires that appropriate measures be taken.
How can we explain what is happening? Russia is succeeding, and you have information because you are very close to Western intelligence services in the plural. And Didier Francois, on the degree, indeed, the number
of soldiers,
Russian that they managed to gather.
And even, on that, the Ukrainians also have the same information. Everyone is clearly working on it. Russia had set a goal at the beginning of the year for 2024, an initial target of 385,000 contract recruits, so on a contractual basis, because they want to avoid mobilization. And the idea was to have a third to create new units and 2/3 to replace losses if they have absolutely colossal losses on the offensives, they say. Ukrainian estimates put the number between 1,000
are injured, not dead. And
they actually achieved their goals during the first 6 months, and then they realized that the losses were mounting, so they made an extra effort recently, which started this summer, and with a will of 45,000 additional recruits, and they really put the financial means to do it. So it started before the race, even if behind with the race, they have 2 or 3 goals, but huge.
Average. We can recall the figures, 52,000 euros just for the first year, which is huge in Russia. This is only
far from Moscow. In Moscow, it's 59,000
euros, and
they pay 2,600 euros per month. Can you imagine for a Russian where the average salary is barely even 200 euros? They receive 2,700 euros, 500 euros per month to go fight, to go kill Ukrainians. And then, of course, there is also the bonus right away, the bonus that comes from the federal government. And also the local bonus for Muscovites, for those who are the privileged, who do not want to go die where...
Where does he find the money? Where does he find the money? Because the Russian economy is doing poorly. The bank...
Russian central bank.
She said it herself, and they apparently have reserves.
They still have some reserves because there are countries, I would say, very friendly to Russia who continue to buy oil, who continue to do other trades with the Russians by maintaining this effort of Putin's war. Of course, the sanctions, even if the sanctions work very well, but this is not enough. There are not enough sanctions. The Russians can still do it today. But they go so far that they will go everywhere to look. He recruits from them. He also recruits abroad. We see people, fighters of all colors in Russia, that is to say blacks are still quite rare in the Russian plains, you see, so we still see them on the battlefields. So really, these are the difficulties. And if they start to...
Sorry, it's clear he doesn't. Sadly, Ukraine's ability to recruit has decreased. Russia, you say, yes, there is African fighters. There are maybe a few, but the bulk of these fighters, they are indeed Russian fighters. Who then is it out of commitment or for the money? Yes, Xavier.
Titelman, and it was also said, moreover, Moscow offers a bonus of 20,000 euros to soldiers who
are willing
to sign this contract. It's considerable.
The signing bonus alone represents more than a year and a half of the average salary in Russia. And in fact, he also walks to the dressed boat. That is to say, today, Russia's pockets are almost empty, so they are issuing a lot of rubles. So there is, due to high inflation, the central bank raised its key rate to 19% this week and plans further increases. It's
a real war economy. That is to say, it's a race forward, a flight forward, which is really the commitment to war. And that's what impoverishes
the Russians at
daily with
the influx of money is paid in rubles. That is to say, I also have indirect feedback from people who wanted to get involved, Indians who were on the spot, who were paid in ruble, and no one wants to exchange their ruble for dollars because it's forbidden.
Maybe Jean-Baptiste's reaction, because you are here, you are back from the front, you have faced the Russian soldiers. Do you have an echo of that? Is there a concern among your Ukrainian comrades in arms?
What scares us the most is that the Russians use a lot of human waves, promise a lot, promise the soldiers glory and money. Then we end up with waves of 50, 100 guys, and what scares us is the advances on Pokrovs. It's mainly by human waves, and we end up with a lot of fighters who have very little know-how, very little experience, but it's a bit the technique that Russia used under the Soviet Union. But this...
You've experienced it yourself. You faced this type of fighters? Under what circumstances?
For example, we were based near Ivanivsk, near Bakhmut. And generally, every day around noon, the Russians would launch entire waves, smoke bombs and entire waves of Russians. And it happened sometimes that they would send Russians without weapons, without equipment to go fight against you, but you went on.
Different fronts. You were at Bakhmut, you told us, near Kremina too, on very, very hot spots where it was extremely dangerous. Ultimately, on the spot, you also lack manpower, because there we see it's the ranks of the Russian army that are being replenished. We know that this is the crux of the war, the number of soldiers on the ground. Is that what particularly made you want to enlist?
Yes.
Ukrainian soldiers in general have more experience and the equipment is usually better, but the Russians outnumber us with better weaponry, better equipment. If behind, it's one soldier against 50 soldiers. I have many situations where soldiers just run out of ammunition and have to retreat because simply too many Russian soldiers.
But Jean-Baptiste, please explain thoroughly, as we frequently assume these were urban legends or a transposition of World War II events. Do you really tell yourself that facing you saw waves of unarmed Russian soldiers coming? Yes.
In the Kupiansk forest, I have friends who defended a position for several days. And on the thermal images, we see Russians running without weapons. And the problem is that even without weapons, it uses all our ammunition, it uses our artillery, and then behind they can send Wagner, send the ex-Wagner, send the Spetsnaz. But
so it's not a legend. There really are Russian soldiers who are used as cannon fodder, but
it's something we've seen for a long time. And another little detail that you also explained to me is that they use smoke grenades thinking they're going to hide behind these smoke screens, except that JB and the Ukrainians being equipped with night vision goggles, you can see them transparently with the thermal. We can see thermally through the smoke. So there it's like a training. We see Russians running. But after shooting, the rifles are hot. There are 12 of them defending a position. After killing 100 Russians, they are forced to retreat to the next trench.
Jean-Baptiste's testimony here is very important, and we really thank you for bringing it, because it shows two things. It first obviously shows the harshness of this war, but the mobilization capacity of the Russians, because we can look at it in two ways. That is to say, this is both a weakness of Russia, it's very primitive, but it's a strength, as you were saying. That
works to a certain extent, it works. It's exactly the problem. It's nibbling and the steamroller. So they have a few units that are maneuvering, yes.
Of course.
It's not only about unarmed men, which we already understood, but the
fact that there are so many men.
There are two Russian armies, in fact. But that's what Jean-Baptiste explains well. That is to say, they sacrifice a kind of cannon fodder in front to use up the ammunition and weaken, which is to tenderize, in quotes, finally, to shape the defensive positions. And behind, once there is the wear and tear of combat, etc., then they send in reshaped people, properly equipped, and especially with a huge artillery support and the support of gliding bombs. You should know that Russia has about 100,000 gliding bombs or 120,000 bombs in stock and produces 12,000 capacities.
Something dizzying for us Westerners from the West, where war is something very vague, where frankly no one really wants to go to war in Western Europe again.
But I believe the Ukrainians don't want it either. That's why we need to wake up before Ukraine was...
Ukraine has been at war with Russia since 2014 when Crimea was annexed. And we see another world with this Russia that has a recruitment capacity and a capacity to send men to the front, even armies. Yes?
And an almost primary reality, but which needs to be reminded, is that there are more than 3 times as many inhabitants in Russia than in Ukraine. So inevitably, when you have a very populated country, you have, even if it's expensive, even if it's increasingly difficult, human reserves that Ukraine does not have. And this imbalance, it objectively plays in favor of Russia.
The relative progression of the Russians, one must read what the French Ministry of the Armed Forces says, stating that the initiative is on the side of the Russians. This is part of the bad news of the day for the Ukrainians. It was already yesterday's statement. Why is that? Why do the Russians manage to take the initiative?
The initiative may be on the Russian side towards Pokrovsk, but after the other elements, the other places on the front are not as active.
Yes. The French army. We can read the French army's statement. I don't know if we can display it. Of course it's the
Ukrainian initiative.
Yes, we're discussing the situation within Ukraine. Look, we can read it here if it appears. Russian forces persist in attacking French military targets, cities, and energy infrastructure ahead of winter. They maintain the initiative across the entire front. As Alain points out, the discussion is about Ukraine, not the Kursk offensive. Kursk is in Russia? Si.
It's because they have a certain numerical superiority and still have a logistical superiority compared to the Ukrainians. What Jean-Baptiste was talking about?
Yes.
Absolutely. Because when we talk about initiative, we're talking about freedom of action. This is extremely serious because when we don't have freedom of action, we suffer. And what our comrade just told us is that from time to time, despite the equipment, training, experience, we suffer. And so indeed, they have the initiative because they have the mass that the Ukrainians do not have. So they can vary their efforts. And we can clearly see that the initiative of the race has not completely, I would say, disturbed the central offensive. And they continue to progress, so they are not breaking through. As for me, we're not there yet. But they are in a state of imbalance. That's obvious, but...
How to explain this? We've said so much that the Russian army is destitute. We've said a lot that the Russian army will no longer have missiles. It's running out of ammunition. It's running out of missiles, etc. We recall the initial images showing numerous units appearing listless, indicating mutiny. And today, despite the Western effort, there are many billions that have been freed up by the West. Despite everything, Russia
has the
initiative, despite...
Didier François warned not to underestimate the Russian army?
Yes.
But the idea is that there are billions given, but this is not with money that we're going to fight on the front. We have to turn these billions into weapons and ammunition. And that's not always the case because many billions also go to support the Ukrainian economy, which is almost flat because it's been destroyed by the war. So these are the difficulties. And also, we must not forget that the actions of the Westerners are not as effective as they need to be. And unfortunately, even today, with deliveries that are almost always late, with the demand for training,
for the
everything,
all this, it means that even if the Russian army is
weak, it is maintained by this lack of effort from the Westerners.
To help the Ukrainians?
2 figures that are Ukrainian figures, but they are real because they are, take on the figure, it's at the bomb level. In 2024, bomb counts increased from 1,218 in January to 4,103 in August. And the drones, what we call FPVs, so these are the drones, almost micro cases, in January 4th, 404, in August 12th, 939. So there is capability today that has been made. We see that since 2022, the Russians have increased their BITD capacity by about 20% because the economy is struggling as they have entered a war economy, focusing all resources on the war effort. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians have faced 2 issues. A mobilization problem that they have started to solve, but a problem where for 8 months they haven't received the stocks they were supposed to have. So they tapped into the stocks. And the stocks that had been made to form the new brigades were used to try to hold the front lines. Today, the stocks need to be replenished. and it happens too irregularly. And so the problem that Ukrainians have in planning is their inability to know how many possibilities they have to hold the fronts. That's why they are forced to make maneuvers, including races, which from a military point of view, honestly, it's not the best solution. But because he doesn't have a solution on the trench lines, you're talking about it.
We would like to give you another number. It's 1 million dead or injured, a figure put forward by the Wall Street Journal. So this toll has been given since the start of the war in Ukraine. Jean-Baptiste, you haven't told us yet?
Said it's the total of both sides. Why?
Absolutely. We don't know if it's the Ukrainians or the Russians. It's on both sides. 1 million dead or injured since
The beginning of this.
war. Jean-Baptiste, why is that you wanted to enlist alongside the Ukrainians to go fight the Russians?
Initially, I went to Ukraine, like many, to help because it's a conflict in Europe, a conflict that is at the doorstep of France. And initially, I went there as a humanitarian volunteer. But then I was in Irpin Bucha. I saw the massacres that were committed.
And one of my best friends in Ukraine was killed there.
About a year ago. So I decided to take up arms, and the war became much more personal after that. So
You were a humanitarian and then you took up arms, and Bucha was a trigger.
that was one of the triggers. Bucha, Irpin, Izium, and it looks a lot like what we read in history books, what we see in movies, the atrocities that the Nazis did. And seeing all the atrocities, understanding that it's a few thousand kilometers from our home, it's complicated to remain passive in the face of that and just turn around and go home thinking it will pass. When you say it's become personal, what do you mean by that? So the first year in Ukraine, I had quite a few friends, quite a few. Like a new family, close ones there, and losing a close friend is quite triggering. And now I have my life there, so it affects me much more personally. And
You're going back there in 2 weeks to continue to fight?
Soon we see the images here of when you're in the trenches. Explain to us first. You have to appreciate you are a volunteer fighter. So it's not the French state that sends you, because in Russia there is always this propaganda that consists of saying France secretly sends fighters. It's not the case. You are all to...
Actually, it's personal.
I just took a Flixbus to get there at the beginning and on arrival. So you left on a fixed bus and the arrival is there in the trenches. What are you doing in the trenches then?
over there, it was near Barmood. I was mainly an icon operator, so we were flying 12 hours a day. So you remotely control these famous drones. Xavier Titelman is there.
Who is translating next to him?
So we fly 12 hours a day or 12 hours a night. So we stay a week in the trench, then a week in the back. And it was like that for about 3 months. So a 3-month rotation, and from about 6 in the morning until 8 in the evening, we fly non-stop to try to find enemy positions, inform about any enemy movement, and we coordinate for artillery, for first-person view drone strikes. The risk of
dying, you
have experienced it directly? Yes, several times. So we are underground in what they call the Ukrainian shields. These are kinds of underground bunkers, buried trenches, but we all know that a direct mortar or artillery fire on the trench, usually the roof collapses on the soldiers. And what often happens in our tree line, once the other soldiers have arrived, the guy comes all alone and tells us, I am the only survivor. It was 100 meters away.
Today, after 2.5 years of war, do you see the outcome of this conflict?
I think it's complicated to say the outcome, but what I'm sure of is that the Ukrainians won't stop and we will fight to the end. For us, there is only one possible outcome. It's victory. Something I can affirm is that the Ukrainians will not surrender. They will fight to the end. And the morale, especially with Kuros, is rising. And the Ukrainians still believe in it after 3 years of war.
One more thing about what's next. Thanks for your strong testimony, Jean-Baptiste. We'll discuss Westerners who seem to be holding back. They are even less so than we thought a few days ago. We thought they were going to authorize long-range missiles to support you. They are backing down.
Is it
any resentment, let's say, against Westerners? The other Westerners? A disappointment?
There's always a disappointment, whether it's for long-range missiles or for the sending of equipment. It's always very slow, and sometimes we're given, sometimes we're told yes, sometimes we're told no. And there's a big feeling at the Ukrainian level. Everyone thinks that if from the first year, if we had been given all the means and all the authorizations, the war would have ended in the first year. And there's a huge feeling on the Ukrainian side that the war is deliberately being dragged out, more of a fed up than anything else. But the Ukrainians are holding on.
Let's talk about this fed up, as you say, and indeed it echoes the news even of the last few hours, since the big news is that the United Kingdom will not go alone.
Many thought that the United Kingdom could help you by authorizing long-range missiles.
No, they apparently refuse this step. That's what they say. They will not go it alone to authorize Ukraine to use long-range missiles against targets in Russia without the agreement of the United States. Why? Because the American guidance systems, they tell us, are considered essential to ensure that the missiles reach their targets. And let's remember, Didier François, the United States has still not given their green light to send new long-range weapons to allow Ukraine to strike Russia directly on its territory.
Anyway, what the American tells us, particularly the head of the National Security Council, who met all the allies 10 days ago, is that there is little chance that a decision will be made before the elections. What are they afraid of? So actually, two things. From the perspective of the American Security Council, it's not a vertical escalation. It's not the risk of nuclear. It's not a half second that the Russians would play at that. It's more of a problem of horizontal escalation. That is to say, the fact that if we go too far in aid, well, if they go too far in aid, because what we initially asked them was to give permission, even if only to the French and the English to use, because there are American components in the missiles that are given to the Ukrainians, to be able to do it anyway. That would pave the way, and it might still happen anyway. But the way to what? To the party that afterwards, the Americans, once the stocks are empty, can take over. It's under discussion, and it won't be before the elections. But sorry, we
get the impression that we've heard a lot on these platforms about the Ukrainians, and you in politics saying the Russians don't have any more means, so he doesn't, no fear to have.
And there we are told that they are afraid of horizontal reaction. What does that mean? Yes. In other words, the missiles, such as the Iranian missiles, which according to the Ukrainians have not yet been delivered and not ready for the arrival. So the idea that, roughly speaking, with too much Western aid on Russian territory, the Russians would go help, for example, the tools to close the canal, the Strait of Bab el-Mandeb and the Persian Gulf, is a concern. So
people remain fearful of potential Russian retaliation.
They are afraid of a Russian reaction, including an indirect one. It's not an escalation on nuclear, it's an escalation on
the extension. Yes, it's a form of climbing. That's how you master it. I think there's a Western fear. It's clear to me. If not, we would have taken the required action sooner and more extensively. So gradually, we watch how it goes, we step it up a notch, there's no reaction on the other side, we step it up a notch, but now it's been going on for 2.5 years.
I believe the situation is worse. They have retreated after going too far. Multiple sources, including the well-informed American press, suggested they were close to taking the leap.
But now we are still very, very dependent on the United States. We can see with the Scalp and the Storm Shadow, which I felt to be Franco-British, that in fact they are dependent on American components, that they want well, and the goodwill of the Americans to allow us to strike at long distance or not at long distance. So indeed, it is still them who have the key, the Americans. Yes, they have the
key, but why are they backing off? Why are they backing off?
That's the question.
I think two things need to be said today. First thing, as President Macron said, we are somewhat in strategic uncertainty. We don't clearly say no, we say we don't completely in agreement, we'll see. So we are in total uncertainty.
Yes, Ukraine have
need now, yes, but we don't know.
Darius, maybe those missiles are being delivered. We don't know today. Unfortunately, it's better that it happens, that it's announced in advance. Because there was this story with the 800,000 shells that were found by the Czech President Pavel. The Russians, upon learning about this, announced it everywhere in all the newspapers. And the Russians, they started to prevent the deliveries. So there is a lot of difficulties delivering these
missiles. No, they already have. Some of these missiles are already in Ukraine, so they would like to use them now. Missiles. Those in Ukraine, they cannot be used because precisely
Russian electronic defense makes them deviate. And we're talking about these missiles where the American components are significant because
these components,
they're allowed to deviate the defense. 2 rockets.
Why?
These
reservations? Think for domestic policy reasons as well. There is debate within the Biden administration. We know that Jack Sullivan, for instance, is extremely cautious. And then, in the same way, the Democratic team knows that a number of Americans are very reluctant about this aid. And the closer the November election gets, I think the more cautious they will be. In the same way, you have Olaf Scholz in Germany, who is facing a rise of radical parties that are opposed to the war in Ukraine, and who has already announced that he would reduce German military aid to Ukraine next year.
The famous word that General Yakovlev always uses, saying, Americans calibrate the war by doing what they want without exceeding a certain threshold, primarily to avoid Russia's collapse.
And the question is asked, what are they afraid of? They fear their own shadow. It does not have absolutely no red line that posed any problem once it was crossed. Every time we provided ground equipment, melee, long-range missiles, there never been a problem. When the Russians suffered Ukrainian attacks on their territory, because there was the offensive of Kharkiv, it did not cause any problem.
When the Ukrainians shoot down Russian fighter jets and Russian helicopters over Russian territory with the Patriots, it doesn't
cause any problem.
I don't understand why we are still questioning this decision.
Appreciate the dialogue between them. Often the Americans call the Russians.
We must remember, we make comparisons with the Second World War, but we can't imagine Churchill calling Hitler to say, listen, here we are. What is...
You think about it. What is...
You think of reaction, so...
In reality, Churchill called Roosevelt?
Did not call himself Hitler?
Is it?
Are we in a situation where, in fact, they continue to talk to each other, indeed,
to a certain extent, and
even calibrate a bit among themselves?
That might be one of the keys, but I'm a bit like Guillaume. I believe a lot in American domestic policy issues. The Americans today are in a pre-election period. They don't have the upper hand. They are concerned about their business. So it may be resolved after November or not, because if it's Trump, it will be something else. But for now, they are on something else, and it's certainly not the priority of the Americans currently.
Thank you all for being with us. Thank you, Jean-Baptiste, for coming to testify on Visage Découvert on this stage.